Hello friends, this is Jim with Science Talk. I have here with you some troubling data to share with you, and it involves how life forms are declining rapidly across the planet. Some of you may or may not have heard or have read the superb work by Elizabeth Kolbert called the Sixth Extinction, which, by the way, rightfully so, won her a Pulitzer Prize. It's an excellent piece of scientific work, and it's been out a couple years now, but it's recommended reading. And in this book, she relates all the declines of life forms across the planet, the causes of it, and I'm going to take basically with some recent information, combining with some of her finding, just going to share with you some of the things that are going on. Let's start with insects. Now, when you look at overall life on this planet, at least for the non-producing organisms, that is animals. Okay, we're not going to be really looking at. Well, I think later on I have some information about trees to share with you, but we're looking at heterotrophs, organisms that have to obtain the energy from ingesting food matter pre-made. Autotrophs make their own food, plants, phytoplankton, algae, etc. Of all the animals on the planet, 97% are invertebrates. And of the nearly 2 million species on this planet, 70% are insects. So insects, we're living in the age of insects. And of the insects, the largest order are the coleopterans, the beetles, which led to that famous, I think it was, who was it that said, an inordinate fondness for beetles. I think it might have been Huxley, I'm not sure about that. But there's a famous quote from the 1800s, shortly after Darwin's Origin of Species was published. So, 70% of insects make up the 2 million known species. Many of these insects are foundational for the food chain, for land animals, just very much like plankton for the marine systems. Well-known Harvard entomologist and who specializes in ants, Dr. E.O. Wilson, once observed that if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And guess what? Insects are vanishing. So, about a year or so ago, it was a long-term study for the decline of insect populations. Some of the initial finding was reported. And in 63 nature reserves across Germany, a team of scientists concluded that the flying insect population had dropped by a staggering 76% over a 27-year period. At the same time, other studies began to highlight dramatic plunges across Europe in the population of individual species of insects, bees, bugs, moths, etc. Now, insects provide food for many organisms, from other insects. Other insects can predate upon smaller species, but also birds, bats, lizards, a whole bunch of insectivores. Insectivores are creatures that feed exclusively or nearly exclusively on insects, and that could be shrews and voles and other small mammals and lizards, etc. So, and they make up, they have a lot of biomass, and they support the ecosystem. If they having precipitous declines, which we are seeing, then you talk about the bottom coming out from underneath the whole food chain becomes very evident and is indeed a troubling development. So what is contributing to this collapse? Definitely is human caused. Habitat degradation, use of insecticides, pollution, and industrial agriculture, and indeed climate change. Climate change is actually making things warming up so rapidly that many organisms cannot adapt fast enough. And here's another interesting thing that I had actually not considered until reading some of these reports: light pollution. Makes sense. Light pollution that can mess up nocturnal insects. Maybe they don't behave like they're supposed to, or it interferes with their breeding. And we all know that there's plenty of light pollution across the planet. So, American entomologist Bradford Lister, he first visited El Yunque National Forest in Puerto Rico in 1976. And over the past 4 decades, he has examined populations of arthropods. Arthropods literally means jointed legs. Arthropods include insects, spiders, centipedes, lobsters, crabs. You get the idea. And the populations of arthropods in El Yunque dropped by 98%, nearly wiping them all out. And by the way, El Yunque is the only tropical rainforest within the U.S. National Forest System. And so, obviously, as I just said, if you have insects dropping off, guess what? Insectivores are going to drop off just as well. Birds, bats, lizards, toads, you name it, right? Frogs, and so on. And this is even before Hurricane Maria came stomping through. So what caused this devastation? Okay. So after eliminating habitat degradation or loss, it was a protected national forest. After eliminating pesticide use, which has decreased in Puerto Rico by 80% since 1969, Lister and his Mexican colleague Andres Garcia came to conclude that climate change was the culprit, because the average maximum temperature in that rainforest increased by 4 degrees Fahrenheit over those 4 decades. The same 4 decades. That is a significant increase. So now this is leading many entomologists worldwide that they're convinced that the collapse of insect population is indeed a worldwide phenomenon. So, we're now coming into what's called connecting the dots, and which is what we've been doing. Now, basically, we're no longer just taking individual events and examining them. We're now taking the individual events and seeing how it relates to other individual events, and then connecting the dots. And so what's becoming part of what's called climate change communication, basically connecting the dots in order to help the public understand how individual events are part of a larger trend. 1 point does not make a trend, 2 points don't make a trend. You start getting 3, 4, 5, etc. Then we can start saying there's something going on. And that's now where the focus on scientists is. In addition to studying particular events and particular little topics, they're now taking that and extrapolating to the larger question at hand. So they now have come up with a term called biological annihilation as a way to explain plummeting insect populations as well as the organisms that feed on them. We can then even look at the edge of the sea. Okay. In 1955, environmentalist and scientist Rachel Carson published a book called The Edge of the Sea. Now, I did a video, a segment exclusively discussing Rachel Carson. It was done some time ago, but if you have not seen it, please check it out. She literally was the grandmother of the environmental movement, especially her book Silent Spring, where she basically scientifically demonstrated with extreme high confidence that pesticides, especially like DDT, was causing bird populations to plummet, such as ospreys, bald eagles, and other such creatures. Basically, the DDT was causing the eggshells to get thin, and then when the birds go to lie on them to incubate, their weight was crushing the eggs, and therefore the clutch was a failure, and there was no chicks produced. So she demonstrated that, and that led to the banning of DDT, and later on we then get the EPA, Clean Air, Clean Water Act, and so forth. We can thank her. Unfortunately, the Trump administration with Pruitt, well, he's now gone, but the EPA has basically been turned into a non-existent entity. It's unfortunate. A lot of the advances have been reversed. So, anyway, be that as it may, what she, at the edge of the sea, what she was looking at was the extraordinary diversity and density of invertebrate life that occupies the Intertidal Zone. Now, the Intertidal Zone, as the name implies, will be during high tides, is covered in water, and during low tides, it's exposed to the air. So it's in between, being always submerged and then partially submerged and not submerged at all. We go further up the shoreline, further inland, away from the sea. And basically the point she was made is that the diversity that we see in the Intertidal Zone is akin to what we see in a forest. And there's a gentleman named by Tim McNulty. He published a book, Olympic National Park, A Natural History. He basically pointed out that the plant associations of the low tide zone are commonly arranged in multi-storied communities, not unlike the layers of an old growth forest. And to use the analogy of the old growth forest, the starfish was basically the top predator of this intertidal nearshore habitats. So then what's going on? In 2013, starfish started dying off in alarming numbers. And they were calling it the sea star wasting disease, which was caused by a virus. And this was first observed in Washington's Olympic National Park, although it wasn't confined only to there. Linda Mathis reported in the Seattle Times more than 20 species of starfish from Alaska to Mexico have been devastated. And even the young sea stars, starfish used interchangeably, the young sea stars, they would take a little longer to show any symptoms, but once they did, they pretty much died very quickly. So what was the cause? Climate change-induced warming of the Pacific Ocean put stress on the animals while it made the virus that attacked them more virulent. Yeah, it's like a 1-2. Warmer ocean puts a physiological stress, and they're exposed to this virus. The virus do better in the warmer temperatures, so the virus are more virulent and basically can really work to kill the starfish. Concurrent with the disappearance of the starfish, another unprecedented, in quotes, die-off was happening at the edge of the same waters along the Pacific coast of U.S. and Canada, and it involved seabirds. A lot of seabirds have been dying off. For example, the Cassin auklet, thick-billed murres, common murres, fork-tailed petrels, short-tailed shearwaters, black-legged kittiwakes, northern fulmars. It's still ongoing. There was even an article that appeared some time ago, a couple of years back, in the Audubon magazine. In Alaska, starving seabirds and empty colonies signal a broken ecosystem. Now, these birds, of course, seabirds typically will feed on fish. So, as I mentioned before, 97% of animals are inverts, so the other 3% are vertebrates. There are 62,839 known vertebrate species that include fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. There are more fish species than all the other species of vertebrates combined, and of the land vertebrates, birds are the far numerous. In fact, with mammals, there's only about 4,000 known or identified species of mammals, and most of them belong to the orders Rodentia and Chiropteran, which are basically rats and bats. So, I mentioned earlier the term biological annihilation that was introduced in 2017 in a very important paper by scientists Geraldo Ceballos, Paul Ehrlich, and Rodolfo Durzo. Now, a quick word about Dr. Paul Ehrlich. He's of Stanford University. He came out with a book in the 70s, the mid-70s, called The Population Time Bomb. And he basically warned of human overpopulation causing a stress on the ecosystem. And basically he was saying that humans are putting more and more demand on resources, be it land for housing, for food, for energy, and so forth. He was ridiculed at the time. He still gets ridiculed today, saying, well, geez, Paul, that hasn't happened yet. And there are still people saying, that's what he brought forth is not an issue with all this new technology and so on. We can get around that, etc., etc. Well, they're wrong. I have explained to you guys numerous times before the concept of the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. Basically, it's defined as the number of individuals of a species that an ecosystem can support based on continued available resources. Food, water, space, that sort of thing. And when you look at it, there are far too many humans on the planet for the system to be sustainable. That's just the blunt biological truth. So, and I discussed this with you guys before in other video segments talking about the pressure for land for growing food, housing people in areas that are habitable. Middle East is going to be uninhabitable in a few decades if things continue as they are now. Arctic region, everyone going to move to Ellesmere Island? Everyone going to go to Baffin Island? It's a little tough living up there. So when you look at that, and considering that 71% of the planet's surface is covered by water, and if you look at the remaining 29-30% of the land, how much of that is really appropriate for human usage, there's not much land available. Something has to give. So going back to these three gentlemen, their research focused on population declines as well as extinctions of vertebrate species. Our data, they wrote, indicate that beyond global species extinctions, Earth is experiencing a huge episode of population declines and extirpations. Now, I just posted a video where I discussed this, but this past October, a 148-page Living Planet report by the World Wildlife Fund International and the Zoological Society of London. Basically, this is what they found. Between 1970 and 2014, they looked at the populations of vertebrates. Monitored populations of vertebrates had declined in abundance by an average of 60%, that's what a 60% globally, with particularly pronounced losses in the tropics and in freshwater systems. South and Central America suffered dramatic loss of 89% of such vertebrates. Freshwater populations of vertebrates declined by 83% worldwide. The results were based on 16,704 populations of 4,005 vertebrate species. So basically, what this indicates, it's not comprehensive, but we can certainly do statistical extrapolations. And so we can kind of treat it as basically like a barometer of what, extrapolate what could be happening to all vertebrate species. What could be driving this trend? The main causes are overexploitation of species, agricultural land conversion, all driven by, this goes back to the point I just made a few moments ago, runaway human consumption. And it does acknowledge that climate change is also a major factor. Now, looking at North America, the report says, oh, the decline is only 23%. That's misleading because it depends on what's happening. But anytime you have a decline, a loss of species, whatever, that's going to affect the ecosystem. So it's 23% of vertebrates. Remember, this is looking at vertebrates. It's not taking into account insects, other invertebrates. And of course, with that, they haven't even looked at what's going on with the plants and what's happening to the plants, providing the basis for any food chain. So this is very alarming. So I'm going to go look at something a little specific here for you now. In the desert southwest of the U.S., there's the pinyon juniper woodlands. And it tends to be a low canopy, sparsely vegetated woodland ecosystem, but amazingly, it supports an incredible diversity of wildlife. Take, for example, the state of New Mexico. It has among the greatest diversity of species in the country. It's second in diversity of native mammals, third in birds, and fourth in overall biodiversity. Let's look at birds. It trails only California and Arizona in the diversity, right? I said third in birds. The state harbors 544 species, nearly half of the 1,114 species in the U.S. overall. Between 2001 and 2005, a tiny bark beetle known by the name of Ips confusus had killed more than 50 million of them. This is pinyon juniper trees. About 90% of the mature ones in northern New Mexico. This was the result of a combination of severe drought and rapid warming, which stressed the trees, while providing a superb environment for the beetle population to explode. There's something similar going, if you look throughout the West, if you look at the coniferous trees, a lot of them have this rusty colored aspect to them. That's by the bark beetles killing the trees. We're now seeing the spruce bark beetle here in Alaska, where it's now, they're expanding the range north because the winters are no longer severe enough to kill the larvae. So now the spruce bark beetles are finding their way into the trees in interior Alaska, and it's starting to have some devastating effects. So, multiple species of bark beetles were ravaging forests across the North American West. The black spruce, the white spruce, the ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, white bark pine, the pinyon were all dying, all being devastated by various beetles, bark beetles. In fact, trees are dying all over the world. It's now moving over to trees. In 2010, scientists from a number of countries published a study in Forest Ecology and Management that highlights global climate change-induced forest mortality with data recorded since 1970. Now, this is about a decade ago. And they were basically recording a massive die-off. This is published in 2010. What further mortality has since taken place? Towards in the middle of 2018, Los Alamos National Laboratory ornithologist Jean Fair and her colleagues released the results of a 10-year bird study on the Pajarito Plateau of New Mexico's Jemez Mountains, where some of the worst pinyon die-offs have occurred. What they found was that between 2003 and 2013, the diversity of birds declined by 45%, and bird populations on average decreased by 73%. The pinyon die-off that led to the die-off of birds is an example of connecting the dots across species and over time in one place. Okay, another study looking at birds, back to birds. A study published in 2014 pointed out that as many as 988 million birds die each year in the U.S. by flying, crashing into windows, or domestic and feral cats kill up to 2.4 billion birds and 12.3 billion small mammals annually in the U.S. Cats have a devastating effect on populations. In Australia and Canada, two other places where great numbers of birds have been killed by felines, the estimated numbers are 365 million and 200 million, respectively. Another case of connecting the dots across places and species when it comes to various forms of biological annihilation happening on the planet. So, these avian, I guess for lack of a better word, massacres, one is a result of modern architecture, like buildings, glass, windows, you just fly into them. Others stemming from non-native organisms with excessive predations. This is nothing new. This goes back centuries. You know, look at the mass killing of Arctic whales in the 17th century. It made a lot of nations rich. Look at the book that Farley Mowat wrote called Sea of Slaughter, where he depicts what happened to the great auk, sometimes called the penguin of the north. They numbered in the millions. They're now extinct. You know, sailors would come over from Europe. The great auk really had no fear of humans. They'd never seen humans. They weren't really predated upon, and they were easy pickings. Eggs were nutritious. The meat was nutritious. You know, they could use the plumage and so forth. And next thing you know, within 100, 150 years, they were all extinct. So, all the things we're talking about, the changes to the environment, pollution, insecticide, agricultural use, and then climate change itself, okay, what is required of us if we are to reverse this trend of great numbers of animals dying off, we reverse this trend. Not only do we need to get off of carbon, fossil-based fuels, okay, but we need to just reevaluate our modern life, our modern lifestyle, and the institutions, and how we basically conduct things. So yes, we need to get off of fossil fuels. We need to go into renewable. Yeah, yes, there are issues involved with that, and I've discussed that in other video segments. But we really need to do a reevaluation of our modern society and how we can change things, preserve other life forms. Because we are part of nature, we are not separate from nature. If we don't understand this lesson, then we are dooming ourselves to extinction. Basically, this shows the interconnectedness, how everything is connected together. We are part of the ecosystem, not separate from it. Everything is connected together. This will affect that and the interactions and so forth. So I wanted to bring you this kind of a summation of some examples of some of the extinctions or the massive die-offs that are leading to this sixth extinction currently underway. It is alarming, and the trend needs to stop and be reversed. So another lengthy video, but thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. We'll talk soon. Hey folks, this is Jim here reminding you to subscribe to this channel, to share my videos, tell others of the work that I do here. I also ask that if you are not already a patron at Patreon, to please consider becoming a patron at Patreon. You can find the information in the description box below the video. I'm asking you to help support the work that I do. I do not take any money from corporations or from any other sources. So the information I share with you is the actual science as it comes out of the peer-reviewed journals. So there is no BS, there's no propaganda, there's no agenda. It's just I present the science and I explain to you what it means, or at least my interpretations of it, based on my own experience as a scientist. I want this channel to grow. I consider, while I discuss many different topics here, you notice I do focus a lot on climate issues. I consider climate change to be the most pressing issue facing humanity today. Thus, I consider it important to disseminate this information to a wider and wider, more and more people. And I need your help to do this. So, yes, please subscribe. Please tell others of the work that I do here. Please share my videos on social media platforms, with your social media groups, what have you. We need to get this information out there. So for those of you who are supporting me on Patreon, I thank you greatly for your support and continued support. It does mean a lot to me. So together we can get this information to more and more people. Thank you. Thank you for your support.